Chapter 1. Something for Dad. Mother was going to Europe and leave us by ourselves. It was not an easy thing, but it was something she had to do for Dad. For us too. Frank carried her suitcases down the front steps to a taxicab parked under the porch of our house in Montclair, New Jersey. The driver climbed out of his air-cooled Franklin and gave a hand. "You the oldest boy?" he asked Frank. Frank told him he was. Frank was 13. "It's going to be tough on your mother, all you kids and you the oldest boy." Everyone knew it was going to be tough. There wasn't any use talking about that. "I'll put them on the train myself," said the driver, pointing his head at the suitcases. "I heard about your father." Frank climbed the steps and joined the rest of us on the porch just outside the front door. That was where we usually said goodbye when Dad went away on his trips. Dad had died 3 days before, on June 14 of 1924. It seemed longer. He had had a heart attack at the railway station in Montclair. It had happened in a telephone booth while he was talking with Mother over the phone. Dad liked regimentation and for everything to be done by a system. He had even assigned each of us a number, which he used for routing intra-family correspondence and memoranda. Mother was not that way. But from habit we lined up on the porch as we would have for Dad, by age, and in sort of a company front formation. Anne, the oldest, she was 18, was at the tall end of the line. Jane, the youngest, not quite 2, was at the short end. In between was Ernestine, Martha, Frank, Bill, Lillian, Fred, Dan, Jack, and Bob. Anne told us to dress right on her. Dad always liked the line to be straight. We waited there for Mother. We were not accustomed to seeing her in black. She looked tense and alone as she pushed open the screen door and came to the head of the steps. We wished she'd let some of us go with her to the boat, or at least to the Montclair station. Mother stood there, tall, slim, and quite beautiful. Her figure never even whispered that she had had a dozen children. Mary, the next to the oldest, had died of diphtheria in 1912. Her veil was pushed back over her hat, and her face was white and taut. A few strands of red hair, the only part of Mother's person that wouldn't do her bidding, curled defiantly from under her hat. Everything else was black and white. Whenever Dad said goodbye there on the porch, he always made believe we were secretly glad to get rid of him. Nothing would have been farther from the truth, because we worshipped him and he knew it. But he'd say we were only waiting for him to get out of earshot before we'd start a wild celebration that would run far into the night. He'd tell us our long faces didn't fool him any, and that someday he was going to ride around the block and come back and catch us, decking the halls with boughs of holly, building a bonfire, burning him in effigy, and, the biggest sin of all, even using one of his Durham duplex razors. Mother didn't want us to know how she felt about leaving, so she smiled and tried to act like Dad. "Those long faces don't fool me any," she boomed as heartily as she could. "Just as soon as I'm out of sight." Then the boom dropped to a whisper and she couldn't go on at all. She held out her arms and we broke ranks and burrowed into them. She didn't trust herself to talk for a while, and neither did we. Finally, she pulled herself loose and started down the stairs. Just before we got to the cab, she turned and looked at us, at each one of us. Mother had a way of making each child know he meant something very special to her. Not just as one of the group, but as an individual person who has his own special claim on her heart. "I love you so," she said quietly. "I wouldn't leave you if it didn't seem the only way we can stay together later on. You know that, right? Don't you?" We knew it all right. Most of Dad's money had gone back into his business. Mother was going to try and operate the business herself. That was the one reason the trip to Europe was necessary. If she failed, the family might have to be divided or move in on Mother's relatives on the West Coast. Mother's mother had invited us all to come and live with her in Oakland, California. Since there were so many of us, Mother thought it would be a bit of an imposition. More, in fact, than she was willing to impose on anyone, even her own mother. Several of Dad's friends had offered to adopt some of us. None of us had wanted that. Don't worry about us, Anne assured Mother now. Everything will be Hotsy, honest. I'm sure it will, dear, Mother smiled. Not only Hotsy, but Totsy too. The driver started to help her into the cab. I'm sorry about your husband, he said. Thank you very much. Now Mother's voice sounded far away. I talked to a fellow that saw it happen. It must have been an awful shock for you. Shut up, Frank whispered fiercely. Why can't he just shut up? Anne nudged Frank sharply, and he was quiet. We got back into line as the cab started down the driveway. We could see Mother waving from the window in the back. Lillian, who was 10, burst into tears. I want to go with Mother, she sobbed. Tell her to come back. Anne took 2 steps and stood in front of Lil, blocking her from view. I told you not to do that, Anne said between her teeth. I told you the first one who did that before Mother left I was going to murder. Anne sounded as if she meant it. I can't help it, Lil cried. She's got to come back. All the way up to Eagle Rock Way, we could see Mother waving. We smiled and waved back. Lil stopped crying before the car was out of sight, and Anne stepped aside so that Lil could wave too. The car disappeared around a curve, and Lil burst into tears again. I didn't mean to, she sobbed. Honest, I didn't. It's all right, Anne told her. We knew you didn't. Do you think she could see me at the end when I was waving? I'm sure she could, Anne said. Of course she could, honey. And Anne burst into tears herself. We went back into the house, and suddenly we didn't feel so depressed anymore. Perhaps it was at saying goodbye we had dreaded, even more than being without Mother. Mother had gone on trips before, and we had lived through them. And she'd be back in a little more than a month. Everybody, said Anne, drying her tears, did fine. I think Mother was proud of us. We'll get things running like clockwork around here, Ernestine told us. Mother won't know us when she gets back. We began to see what seemed the end of everything might really be just a beginning. There was a certain exhilaration in knowing that Mother had had enough confidence to leave us by ourselves. Yes, sir, said Anne almost gaily. Everything went so well that, for the first time, I think we're going to make a go of it. She was fairly beaming now. Everybody behaved so well I could just kiss you all. I knew it, said Bill, ducking. The minute Mother leaves, you start making threats. Anne grabbed him and planted a resounding, moist smack on the side of his neck. Bill struggled, giggled, and hollered. The noise sounded fine after 3 days of whispers. The tension began to drain out of us. I know we're going to be able to stay together, Ernestine said. I'm so sure of it now I could go build that bonfire Dad always talked about. Let's see, Anne grinned. Where is the nearest holly tree? You keep away from his razors, though, Frank warned. I'm going to be needing those one day. Ernestine and Martha hooted. Bill mentioned something about how the cat would finally be fully competent to lick off any whiskers that Frank had at present, or might produce for years to come. Anne kissed Bill loudly again, and he hollered some more. Frank ran an exploratory hand across his chin, but there was no sound of sandpaper. Mother sailed with the tide that morning aboard the Cynthia for England. Dad had been scheduled to speak at the London Power Conference and to preside over a session of the World Congress of Scientific Management at the Masaryk Academy in Prague, Czechoslovakia. These 2 honors meant his work in motion study and the elimination of fatigue in industry were being recognized internationally. Dad had been a consulting engineer, an efficiency expert, specializing in big industry. He was the creator of motion study, which, as one skeptic alleged, Dan never denied either, was designed to make it easy to work hard. Dad's method was to study a worker's motions and then to cut down those motions, often by redesigning the machinery that the man operated. Mother was his business partner. She had given him 12 children and had written with him a 6 books explaining motion study. Now she wanted to make certain he received the recognition the European meeting would bring. And so did we. She had been invited to substitute for him at the 2 sessions. At first, that had seemed out of the question to accept, and then it seemed to be the one opportunity to keep the family together. Engineering was, and still is, a man's field. Mother knew it would be difficulties in trying to continue Dad's business, but if she made a success of her 2 speeches in Europe, before some of the biggest engineers in the world, she might have an easier time in convincing Dad's clients that she could do the work. Mother was not accustomed to making decisions. Those in the past had been left to Dad. He had set the pattern and she had followed. Even the idea of 12 children had been his originally. But if Dad had thought the idea was good, Mother was convinced it was marvelous. There was a time when Mother wept easily, when she was afraid of walking alone at night, when a lightning storm would send her shuddering to a dark closet. All that ended the day Dad died. It ended because it had to end. It ended because of the realization that what she really feared was something would separate them. Well, what she had feared had happened, and the tears would not wash out a word of it. So she gave his speech in London and presided for him in Prague, and she was not afraid any more.